Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Over the last few weeks, we looked at a lot of historical markers. In particular, last week, for example, we looked at the 50th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. As a matter of fact, in the second hour today, we're going to talk about the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty and how that is going. And certainly have talked about a number of kind of historical markers, and we're going to come to another one today. We're coming up to the 40th anniversary of the resignation of President Richard Nixon, and it is all entailed in a book that really talks about what preceded that, called The Greatest Comeback, how Richard Nixon rose from defeat to create a new majority. It is written by our good friend Pat Buchanan. He was the senior advisor to 3 American presidents, ran twice for the Republican presidential nomination, and was also the Reform Party candidate. He has all sorts of best-selling books right from the beginning: Not an Empire, The Death of the West, so many. This one, The Greatest Comeback. He has also been a member of 3 of America's foremost public affairs shows, NBC's The McLaughlin Group, CNN's The Capitol Gang, and Crossfire. He is a political analyst now for MSNBC. And Pat Buchanan, we count you as a great friend of Point of View, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, delighted to be back here, fellas. How are you?
We are excited about this, and I guess I'll start out with the video that we have made available. I think you gave that at the Nixon Library. We also have information, but the first words you heard from the newly inaugurated president, 37th president of the United States, was, Buchanan, was that you throwing the eggs? If you would explain the context, because it helps us understand how hostile the environment was when Richard Nixon became 37th president of the United States.
Sure. It was the inauguration of Richard Nixon, January 20th, 1969. And I was in the back of the reviewing stand at the White House, behind it, walking with Shelley, my future wife, on some boards to get into the reviewing stand for the parade. And the Secret Service behind me, I could hear him saying, "Would you please, Mr. Buchanan, move off the boards?" And I stepped into the mud, and Richard Nixon passed me by, the new President of the United States, and says, "Was that you, Buchanan, throwing the eggs?" It seems that Mr. Nixon, the president's limousine, as he passed 12th Street, was showered with debris, rocks, eggs, and all manner of things, from people denouncing him for the war in Vietnam and denouncing the war. But it was indicative of the city to which Richard Nixon had come. Both houses of Congress were against him for the first time in 150 years that had happened. The media were against him. The bureaucracy was New Deal, Fair Deal, Great Society, was hostile. We came to a hostile town, and that was indicative.
Well, and I think it illustrates, again, something that really was unprecedented, because you did not have either House of Congress. You had a hostile media, which later on probably accentuated some of the things happening during Watergate. But I also want to spend a fair amount of time talking about this idea of comeback. I had somebody the other day say, well, I think we should renominate Mitt Romney. Well, forget whether or not you think that's a good idea. Other people said, well, that doesn't happen. I said, well, no, you got to remember Richard Nixon. And maybe we need to set the scene, because here is an individual that rose to prominence relatively quickly. If you go back to when he was elected in 1946, then he becomes senator. He all of a sudden is on the ticket as a vice president, and then loses one of the closest elections in American history in 1960. I first met Richard Nixon, interestingly enough, in 1962, because my father was running for office, and I still, even to this day, have an autograph from then gubernatorial candidate Richard Nixon, who then went on to lose. And then 2 years later, I got to go to the Cow Palace with my father, and we got to see at least three individuals I think most people would know, and that is Barry Goldwater, certainly Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan. And if somebody had come from the future and told us that any one of those three would be elected president, I'm sure my uncle, who was a Goldwater fan, would have said it was Goldwater. My dad might have believed Reagan, although I doubt it. None of us would have believed Ronald Reagan would have been both governor and president, and I'm sure not one person in the entire Cow Palace would have believed that Richard Nixon a few years later would be president of the United States. So that's an incredible comeback.
Well, indeed it is. He was really dead, if you look back on it. He won a tremendous victory in 1950 for the Senate against Helen Gahagan Douglas, which was a brutal race, but Nixon won by the largest margin California had ever produced for a candidate.
Right.
But then, Kerby, he in 1952 and 56, he was on Ike's ticket, but Ike could have won running as a prohibition candidate. He was so strong.
Right.
And Nixon in 1954 led the Republican Party. They lost both houses. 1958, they lost 13 Senate seats, the biggest wipeout in the Senate, I think, in history. Lost to Kennedy in 60, lost in 62 for governor. Campaigned hard for Goldwater in that horrible defeat we had, those conservatives. I envy you having been at the Cow Palace.
You were watching on TV, I understand, with your dad.
I sure was, but
yeah.
I would love to have been there. It was really a raucous, wild convention, whatever you thought of it. But Nixon had been basically seen nationally as a complete loser. I mean, very talented, very able, a statesman in his own right, foreign policy expert, tremendous party man, but you could not win a national election. And the party was flat on its back after Goldwater. We were down to 140 seats in the House. And that's when I joined Richard Nixon, and nobody thought he was going to make any kind of comeback like that. They were talking during the late mid-'60s about an act of self-levitation is taking place here.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important to recognize that in 1962, I was living in California at that time, that's where I grew up, that he gave that very famous press conference, and he said, "You won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference." That's how wrong that was. 6 years later, he is the president of the United States.
It is amazing. I recall telling him when he announced for his nomination, the last day of the New Hampshire primary, February 1, 1968, I said, "Sir, why don't you go up and, as you open your press conference, say, 'Well, it looks like you're going to have Nixon to kick around again.'"
That was such a great line.
He didn't use it.
Yeah, I didn't use it, I know, but you had some good ideas, and you have filled this book. By the way, we have it available on our website, but people certainly can find it in the local bookstore. We've also, Pat, put the video, and it's about an hour long, but people can watch it. I believe that's the one you gave at the Nixon Presidential Library, which, by the way, I might suggest that if you are in California or you're traveling to California, you definitely want to go to the Ronald Reagan Library, which I think is the best of the presidential libraries. But I would say that in that upper tier is also the Nixon Library. I think many people would be very surprised to find all the things that are there. And so those are some great resources that we've made available, plus an article about this particular book that you can read. And of course, we have a link to Pat Buchanan's website. We need to take a break, but when we come back, Pat, I want to spend some time going through this because I recognize almost all of our listeners are younger than you and me. And if they know anything about Richard Nixon, they probably know it through revisionist history. And you've done a very good job in this book, which has almost 400 pages of including some of the memos, some of the pictures, and some of the rest, to recognize that this is a man that has had a profound influence in our life. Everything from giving us William Rehnquist in the Supreme Court to Harry Blackmun, everything from the Environmental Protection Agency to opening the door to China, a variety of issues that we're going to be talking about here today. And so if you are wanting to know a little more about history, certainly this is the case, but I think we can also learn some very important lessons vicariously from the comeback of Richard Nixon, and also begin to see that some of the issues we're dealing with today were the ones he was addressing in the 1960s and 70s. So let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Pat Buchanan as we talk about his book, The Greatest Comeback. A little bit later, we'll get into some other commentaries I know he's made about some of the things happening in our news. So we'll talk with him and you right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the scandal at the Veterans Administration seems to grow larger each day. A recent audit of the VA showed that more than 57,000 patients are still waiting for initial appointments more than 90 days after requesting them. An additional $64,000 are enrolled but have never seen a doctor. This is a scandal that won't be solved by merely changing one or two bureaucrats at the VA. Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich explained why in a pointed open letter to Robert McDonald, the president's choice to head up the Veterans Department. He argues that what is needed is a transformation of the bureaucracy. Gingrich illustrates the problem by using the red bead experiment constructed by Edward Deming. He used a bin full of red beads and white beads mixed together. Deming would explain to an audience his intention to gather up just the white beads. He would plunge the scoop into the bin and bring out a mix of both kinds of beads. Feigning disbelief, he would then appoint other people to wield the scoop. They would also bring up a mix of red and white beads. His point is that you can change personnel in a broken system and you still get failure. People will fail one after the other until the system is changed. Gingrich says that the range and scale of the misconduct at the VA shows that the corruption there, like the doomed attempt to isolate white beads, is not just a problem of personalities, but more importantly of systems, and it goes to the very core of the bureaucracy. He concludes that the VA is a giant fossilized bureaucracy that must be replaced rather than repaired. But he also laments that entrenched bureaucrats, the unions, and the president, along with many members of Congress, will oppose the systemic changes that could actually work. We need a future president and Congress who are dedicated to making real changes in the VA. And frankly, until that happens, we'll be hearing more examples of problems in the Veterans Administration. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us Pat Buchanan. If you'd like to join us a little bit later, we will open up the phones as we talk about his new book, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. Pat, I'd love to talk about a couple of the, if you will, character flaws of Nixon that run all the way through the book, and there may be some lessons we can learn. And one of those is the tendency for Richard Nixon never to forget a slight, and that goes all the way back to when he was the vice president for the United States under Dwight Eisenhower, because in the midterm elections and then eventually with the re-election, Eisenhower came to him and was basically saying, look, you know, we just need to let you go your own way. So I'll give you any cabinet post, well, other than maybe Secretary of State, that's John Foster Dulles. You can have any one of those, but we don't want you to be the vice president when I run for re-election. Well, he ended up being the vice president again for that next 4 terms, but he never really forgot that. And whether you go from the 1950s all the way to the 1970s, sometimes there was a vindictiveness, a retaliation that other people might have just, rolled their eyes and walked away. But he tended to remember those things, didn't he?
Well, certainly when you mentioned the Eisenhower thing, that was the second time that Eisenhower came very close to dropping him from the ticket.
That's right. Checker speech, the first time, yeah.
Yeah, and taking him out of line of succession to the presidency, which obviously Richard Nixon was dreaming of. And that's not something you would really forget. I think Nixon felt deeply wounded by that. But there was no vindictiveness towards Ike, I will say that.
Yeah.
Nixon revered him and thought much of him and really wished he had been closer to Ike. and gave his eulogy and broke down.
In '69.
And gave his eulogy.
Yeah.
But you're right about other incidents. There's no question about it that he remembered these hurts and these injuries. But I will say this, Kerby, that the reason he is president of the United States or became president was that he swallowed hard. He was treated like dirt in New York.
Yes, he sure
came
was.
Back up there.
Yeah.
Javits and Rockefeller, they invited him to nothing. The Republican Party shunned him like some pariah. But then Nixon, when asked, went out and endorsed Rockefeller, and he went out and endorsed Jack Javits for Senate in New York. And he did that realizing that, I think, first because it was his natural tendency in the party to try to bring it together, but in his own interest, he said to himself, if I endorse these fellows for re-election in 66 and 67, and I win the nomination, they're going to have to endorse me in 68. They can't do what they did to Goldwater when Kerby Anderson was out at that convention.
Well, let's talk about that, because he also, in '64, let's back up a little bit, campaigned for Barry Goldwater. And
he did indeed.
And so in some respects, and matter of fact, his speech, if I can give a thumbnail sketch of it, because he was really introducing Goldwater, said after the greatest campaign, this is an individual that will be the next president of the United States. He really was trying to bring the party together. And I do remember that, because I had one member of my family that was a Rockefeller fan, and one member of my family that was a Goldwater fan. And literally, when I was at that convention, I was sitting between the two, listening to them argue and wishing that I could be somewhere else at the time. So we recognize how conflicted 1964 was in the Republican Party. And you remember that as well.
Sure. And see, that is one of the great achievements, I think, of Nixon. Well, he went out for Goldwater, all out for him. And then after the 64 election, he said, look, those people cannot lead the party who walked away from it in its moment of an hour of need. And it was a fair comment, but after he said that, right after 1964, Nixon went out and he campaigned for everybody that asked him to campaign for them in 1966. That's my first year with him, and I was with him all the way. He went into every southern state, campaigned for everyone. We weren't running any segregationists, Republicans weren't, and we ran against those Democrats there. The only ones he wouldn't campaign for were members of the John Birch Society, whose leader had called Ike, Nixon's old boss, a conscious agent of the communist conspiracy. But everyone else he campaigned for. And by doing that, when the returns came in, there was such a huge victory in 1966, the biggest Republican victory since 1946, when Nixon had come to Congress. And he got an awful lot of credit inside the party for what he did. And it really built up IOUs for 1968.
And that's a lesson I think some people need to learn. For some of our people, again, are not familiar with that part of history, recognize that at this time he was a corporate lawyer, and I may not get the quote right. It's in the book, but it's been a while since I read it. But it's something like, if I stay in corporate law, I'm going to be kind of mentally dead in 1 year and physically dead in 4 years, or something like that. He would bring you into the office and talk foreign policy and all sorts of other issues. And I don't think we've ever had a president in modern times that was more fascinated by foreign policy. What a polar opposite to the president we have right now. And he was really engaged by foreign policy, was engaged by the political process. And it sounds like he was bored to death as a lawyer. Is that true?
That's exactly right. The only law issue that I saw him really get involved was a Supreme Court test where Nixon argued the case before the Supreme Court on a privacy issue that involved an individual who claimed he had been slandered, and Life magazine had sort of done something on it. And Nixon thought that was a real constitutional issue, and he liked arguing before Chief Justice Earl Warren, his old rival. But you're exactly right. He told me, if I had to practice law, Pat, I'd be mentally dead in 2 years and physically dead in 4. And he loved foreign policy, and I traveled with him for 3 weeks in 1967 abroad during the Six-Day War. He would talk about foreign policy, he would talk about personalities, about issues, about politics, about ideology and philosophy. He was really taken up with it. He was a huge secret admirer of Woodrow Wilson, and I tried to figure out why, and one of the reasons, I think, was Wilson was such an enormous figure when he was a boy, from the time he was about 4 till he was 8 years old. Wilson, World War I, going over to Versailles, and then basically dying sort of as a martyr to the League of Nations and cause of peace. And that really riveted Nixon's attention. He wanted to be, I think, he really read constantly about the great men of history, de Gaulle's and Churchill's and all the rest who were famous great men, and he wanted to be a great man who brought peace for a generation. And that was his great dream, I think, in the White House. And even though he's very cold and calculating in foreign policy, behind it all, I mean, people won't admit it or won't like it, but there was a real sense of idealism about what he could accomplish.
Well, and I think, as you have said before, that if he had just simply stepped down after serving for 4 years, he might have been seen as a great or near great president. But, of course, Watergate was his downfall. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But while we're talking about this, we get to 1968 pretty quickly, and that is you have to play, Pat, the what-if game. What if Lyndon Johnson decided to run for re-election? What if Romney or Rockefeller had decided to run? Could have been a much different scenario. What about George Wallace? Help us kind of think through that campaign, because, again, losing in maybe the closest election in American history until that time, then winning in such a close election that I think you figured out if you move, 112,000 votes, Hubert Humphrey was the president.
In California, we're in the House of Representatives, and I think Humphrey would have won there.
Isn't that amazing?
But let me tell you what happened is Nixon had, as we've talked, he stitched the Republican Party together by basically in the first half of 1968. But look what happened to the country then. We went into New Hampshire the very night that the Tet Offensive began, and the Hue massacre of 3,000 Vietnamese in Hue followed that. And then what followed that was we were up against George Romney, who was a candidate of the establishment liberal wing of the party, the Rockefeller candidate. And Nixon was so strong in New Hampshire that Romney quit before the returns came in.
Wow.
And so Nixon was running alone. And then Gene McCarthy, a renegade liberal candidate, wounded Lyndon Johnson in New Hampshire, getting 42% of the vote. Robert Kennedy jumped in 4 days later. Nelson Rockefeller, we thought he was going to get in. He doesn't get in. He announces, I'm not going to get in, at a press conference. And by March 31st, Lyndon Johnson has said, I'm not running again. It was extraordinary. Now, I think we could have beaten Johnson. And I was concerned when he dropped out because I said the nominee is going to be Humphrey, and he's the one candidate who can unite the Bobby Kennedy, Gene McCarthy wing and the Lyndon Johnson wing and Dick Daley wing. But then 4 days after that, Martin Luther King is murdered in Memphis, and 100 American cities go up in flames.
Yeah.
And Americans are saying, look, we need some law and order in this country. This is appalling. What happened to Dr. King was horrible. But, we got troops in every American city. This has never happened before in our lifetimes. So then Bobby Kennedy is assassinated after winning the California primary, and Columbia University goes up in flames. And so we get to the Democratic Convention where I was at, and I was out there. The Democratic Party came apart in the streets of Chicago with cops battling anti-war demonstrators and radicals and clubbing them down with nightsticks right in front of the convention hotel. So Nixon starts the fall race 15 points ahead. But then that great, mighty Democratic Party of those days comes gradually back together after Humphrey calls for a bombing halt in Vietnam. The left comes together with the center, and Humphrey gained 15 points in October of 1968 as Wallace sank like a stone, and all his votes went to Humphrey.
Yeah.
And we ended up dead even, 43-all.
We're going to take a break and talk a little bit more about that because, again, going from losing in one of the closest elections in American history, winning in that one, then, of course, 4 years later in 1972, winning with the greatest landslide in modern history, 62% of the vote, 49 states. Everything except George McGovern's state. So we'll talk about that with Pat Buchanan. And if you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue talking for a few minutes about the greatest comeback. Fascinating book. As you can tell, I'm enjoying it and have enjoyed it. But then also we'll get into a couple of very contemporary issues that I know Pat Buchanan has some opinions about as well. We'll come back and listen to him and hear from you right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Pat Buchanan, our guest, as we talk about his book, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. We have information about his book, an opportunity for you to order it in case you can't find it in your local bookstore. Also, a video that you might want to watch where Pat actually explains everything in the book, and I would encourage you to watch it. Then maybe hit that share button. You can put it on your Facebook page or your blog and educate others. Again, Richard Nixon, the first president since Zachary Taylor in 1849 to take office without carrying in either house of Congress came into a tremendous amount of hostility. But yet again, we've talked just briefly about some of the legacy that he has left behind. I guess probably a better way to say that, bringing the POWs home, bringing the troops home, putting 4 justices on the Supreme Court, including creating things like the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, National Cancer Institute, denounced even for his Southern strategy, but nevertheless also desegregating the public schools of the South. And Pat, there is quite a bit that is the legacy of Richard Nixon, and today young people growing up probably don't even know where some of these agencies that sometimes we like, sometimes we despise, came from, but a lot of those came because Richard Nixon, even with the hostility in Congress, was able to push through lots of legislation that we still are dealing with even to this day.
Well, that's exactly right, Kerby. And it is, again, I think that if you ask some young person that had gotten a normal education in American schools, what did Richard Nixon do and what was he famous for? I think they would say 2 things. Well, he opened China and Watergate.
Yeah, that's probably...
And that is it.
You'd be lucky if you know the first one. Yes.
If you take a look at the foreign policy accomplishments, he had the greatest arms control agreement with the Soviet Union since the 1920s, Warren Harding's naval agreement, the ABM Treaty in SALT I. He opened China to the West and the United States. He brought Egypt out of the Soviet axis, if you will, the Soviet world, and into the United States orbit. He brought the troops home from Vietnam. He ended that war. He brought the POWs home. He created EPA. He appointed 2 chief justices and 2 other members of the U.S. Supreme Court. You're right. Harry Blackmun was one of them. EPA, Cancer Institute, OSHA. He desegregated the South. He got the 18-year-old vote. He ended the draft. All of these things are very controversial. Some can be considered not conservative. But if he had stepped down or something had happened and he had to step down for health reasons, say after his first term, people would be discussing whether he was a great or near-great president.
I think so.
He would be ranked extraordinarily high. But I think everybody looks now at, he the first president to resign in disgrace. And so I think that he has to live with that legacy. But one of the things, if I ever get to write this second book, would be to deal with that whole episode, the Watergate episode, but the other controversies we were involved in battling. And one other thing people forget, Kerby, is Richard Nixon, like FDR, created the greatest political coalition, second greatest of the 20th century. When after he captured the presidency, he put together that 49-state coalition that's kept the Republicans the presidency for 4 out of the next 5 elections, which is an enormous achievement, equaled only by FDR.
Sure. And if you take the very close election of Gerald Ford losing to Jimmy Carter, that could have gone another way, and you could have had a sweep. So certainly the case. Let me, if I can, because I do want to mention Watergate for a minute, and you in there obviously are going to write a whole book about it, but you have this great quote, "A prime minister has to be a good butcher," and you said Nixon was not a good butcher. We've got pictures in your book here of you with Ehrlichman and Haldeman and others. It seems to me that problem could have just been alleviated very quickly. It could have been a minor blip scandal, but it just metastasized into something that brought down the 37th President of the United States.
Sure. Let's take the big event, of course, was the June 17, 1972 break-in at the Watergate offices. Nobody in the White House knew about that. It was news to me. I heard it. A friend called, and I said, oh, my goodness, these guys, probably some clowns over there did this. But nobody knew about it, not the president, not Haldeman or Ehrlichman. And everybody that knew about it was over at the Committee to Re-elect, which was across the street, running a separate operation entirely from our White House, where we were controlling the message and where Nixon went, where the surrogates went, and what was said and everything. And so, but what happened, Kerby, in the first, 24, 48 hours, people came running to the White House and said, save us, we're in trouble, so-and-so did it. And people got knowledge which implicated them, because instead of, natural instincts, if his buddy's in trouble, is going to call the police. He's going to say, what did you do, what happened? And so, but then they got into the White House, and an effort was made to contain the damage, to say, okay, cut it off. They've caught the 5 Cuban fellas or the 4 Cubans and a McCord. and let the prosecutors go through and tell that. And if somebody just over there like Magruder and the creep, if he was involved, he'll have to pay the price, and maybe we can raise money for their legal fees. But instead, they got in, and people used the instruments of government for a short period of time, a week or 10 days, to try to contain it. In so doing, they were contaminated, and they caught it, and it was contagious. And fortunately, nobody came to me that knew something they had done about it, because I wouldn't have done anything, but if you'd had constructive knowledge of it.
Yeah, that's the point. And I'm looking forward to that other book that you were talking about writing, but it's a good illustration of how to also manage a crisis and how to mismanage it and bring down the President of the United States.
Oh, yeah. And I mentioned it's very tough about the Good Butcher. I was down in, matter of fact, it's Easter Sunday. Nixon brought me down to Key Biscayne in one of these little presidential jets and gave me and this lawyer and Ziegler, we spent 10 hours arguing back and forth what's going to happen. And I told him, I think you're going to have to accept the resignations of Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Dean, all of them, because we can't sort out which of them is telling the truth. One of them's going to the prosecutors and the other says he's a liar. But Nixon waited another month to do that, and he did it all under great duress.
Yeah. Those are problems that many presidents have had of letting people go. And, we've seen that in Ronald Reagan's presidency and others. But again, another lesson to be learned here that sometimes, even if they're your friends, even if they've been loyal allies, letting them go early will save the presidency or save the policies that you are trying to implement. And it's all in the book, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. But, Pat, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about, just briefly, some of the columns we've posted by you over the last couple of months. Most of them start with the letter I. So let's take impeachment. You made a very good argument, and I agree with you, that impeachment right now would be a bridge too far. And I haven't heard a lot of people talking about it since you posted that commentary, but for people out there, they're just convinced we need to impeach Barack Obama. I think an individual that saw proceedings of impeachment being drafted against your former boss, how would you come down to that issue of impeachment?
And I saw an attempt to impeach Ronald Reagan when I was at White House over Iran-Contra. And even they were going after George H.W. Bush on what he knew about all of these various events. But my argument is this. We have issues. President Obama is largely perceived to have failed. He's perceived to be diffident, not on top of his job, not caring greatly about it. I didn't go down to the border when that crisis broke there. He's out shooting pool and raising money. And even his own strong supporters, some of them over on MSNBC, are saying, what is he doing? Does he not want the job? And you've got all these problems, and he does not seem to be on top of them. I don't disagree with everything he's doing in foreign policy, but there's no question about it. The country does not feel confident in his leadership. So when you have all that going for you, and even your opponents beginning to agree with you, why would you introduce a subject which will tear our party apart and unite the Democratic Party over for bribery, treason, high crimes, and misdemeanors? I don't know anything he has done deliberately, actively. Passively, there are a lot of things that he has not done, and there are some things where he clearly seems to be crossing the threshold of presidential power. But that's always been a battle between presidents and Congress has got the power of the purse to cut him off, and they haven't done it. So I don't believe we ought to be charging him with the equivalent. I mean, that's a capital punishment thing in politics, the impeachment of the president, and I don't think he merits that. He merits defeat.
Yeah. And as we've pointed out before, if indeed your goal is to remove him from office, that hasn't worked very well. Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and of course you say Richard Nixon stepped down, but those are those. If you say, well, maybe censure, okay, well, I always like to point out Andrew Jackson was censured by the Senate. How well is that working? Well, look at your $20 bill and see how that's working. Not very good. Well,
if it was Andrew Jackson, they're lucky they're alive.
Yeah, that's for sure. Let's take a break, and then when we come back, we'll take our final comments from Pat Buchanan, because we talked about impeachment. Another I is immigration, and if there's one individual that has talked about language and culture and certainly borders, it has been Pat Buchanan. I'd love to get a few of his comments just before we go. But again, if you have not seen this book, just a fascinating book. So many things that what you would learn from the time in which Richard Nixon either was running for office or was in office, and that takes you from really the 1950s all the way to the middle of the 1970s. The Greatest Comeback, fascinating book. We'll come back and continue our conversation with Pat Buchanan. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Buchanan with us for just a few more minutes as we talk about his book, The Greatest Comeback, How Richard Nixon Rose from Defeat to Create the New Majority. Thought we'd get into some other issues as well. And, Pat, you got to admit that unlike John McLaughlin, I don't say wrong, or the answer is, I used to love watching you interact with him. And then, of course, on Crossfire and, of course, today, political analyst for MSNBC. And how you endure it over there, I do not know. But let's, if we can, get to the issue of immigration. I know a lot of our listeners would love to hear some of your thoughts. And if there's anybody that's talked about the importance of language, of borders, and culture, a lot of this goes back to your book, The Death of the West, A State of Emergency, and some of the other things that you've written about. You've got to be very concerned with what is unfolding right now at our southern border.
Well, I sure am. That look, we are you have to ask yourself, Kerby, what is a nation and what really is a people? It's a people of common borders, of common language, history, heroes, cultures, faith, everything. Not not monolithic, but it has an identification. And the America I grew up in, we were a Christian Western nation, predominantly from European descent, with 10% African Americans, all spoke the English language. We'd all gone through the war together. Our parents had gone through the Depression together. Radio, TV, all these things united us. The public schools were, embedded the kids in patriotism and the history of their country. And that country seems to me to be gone. Folks are coming now. They say the melting pot is, culturally repressive. They threw it out. People should speak different languages in public schools. People should come from every religion and every culture on earth. And they celebrate diversity, but what holds us together now?
Yes.
This is what concerns me. You go to places you can't understand, folks. It's become a country that's, much like a larger Brazil or something of that nature, rather than the America we knew. And I just wonder what holds us together. We don't have the old Cold War. At least we all agreed on that. Now we don't agree even on foreign policy. We don't agree on morality or culture or anything.
Yeah.
And so I'm deeply concerned about it, and I think what we need is a moratorium on all immigration, just like we had from 1925 to 1965, so we can assimilate and Americanize the folks who are here so that after 40 years, all of us are speaking English. All of us understand each other.
Well, in America is an idea. I mean, if you want to go to Japan, if you're Japanese, that's the culture. If you go to Sweden, You're Swedish. But we have always been somewhat of a melting pot people, so we've depended on people buying into the ideas. And so assimilation, whether you showed up in Ellis Island, whether you came over in a slave ship, doesn't really make any difference. There was a sense in which we had the culture being assimilating those who were born into it and assimilating those who were coming into it. And I don't sense that happening right now, and as a result, we have sort of a balkanized America, do we not?
That's exactly, balkanization is exactly the term, right. We not only have the ideas of the Founding Fathers on which we agreed. Let me take, I went to the Catholic schools, and there were sort of a Catholic ghetto growing up in the 1940s, but 1950s, 1960s. But we were the kids and in college I went to school with Jewish kids and Irish kids and German Americans, Italian Americans, Slovak, Greek, English, as well as Scotch Irish and everything. But all of us spoke the same language and we had the same culture. We went to the same movies. And there was a unity in the country under Ike and JFK that I think we've since lost. We seem to be at each other's throats over everything today. I mean, even in the bitter days of the Truman-McCarthy era, at least we all agreed on what was right and wrong.
Yes.
And we don't even agree on that anymore.
No, I don't know there's an easy way back, but we recognize that certainly some of that... I don't know
that there's way back, Kerby.
Yeah, I don't know there is. Obviously, the political realm is part of it, but I think a lot of what you're talking about, Pat, is more of a cultural decay, and it almost doesn't matter anymore who you elect as president or who you elect to Congress. They can... to use the old phrase, do no harm. But it seems to me that we are really looking at some cultural changes that need to take place. But you put one on the table, a moratorium on immigration. Do you think Congress is even willing to consider that?
Well, Congress, I believe, has been very cowardly on this issue. Look, when I went down to the border the first time back in 1991 with Duncan Hunter, the father of the present congressman, there were 5,000 people walking in every weekend straight across the border from one of the Mexican village into sort of an American village, Hispanic village. And you said, look, this is our home. You can't walk in here. U.S. citizenship is a very valuable, important thing, and we decide who comes in. The whole world doesn't decide whether or not they're coming to our country. We decide who comes in. And we ought to build a secure fence all along this border because we got something, not an immigration, we have an invasion going on of uninvited folks into this country. By the immigration policy, we decide, and they used to come one by one or in groups or something like that, but you didn't have tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions walking across your border.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I have an easy answer for it, but you've talked about this in the broader sense, the death of the West. I mean, we can be looking at the immigration issue, and that's one of the trees, but as you look at the whole forest, this has been a real concern as well when you look at issues like fertility and the decline of Western ideas and Judeo-Christian ideas. Go for it.
Well, let me say that you take Europe and the United States. Europe is thoroughly de-Christianized. The churches have all emptied out, and the peoples are coming from the Middle East and North Africa and Central and Southern Africa. And Islamic groups are coming into Europe in great numbers now. There's tens of millions in Europe. The peoples of Europe are dying, the Germans and the East Europeans especially. The Russians are going to lose 25 million people between now and mid-century, as are the Japanese, incidentally.
Right.
And their places are being taken by Muslim folks. And you see all these demonstrations now against Israel over the weekend. It doesn't surprise me in the least. They are going to grow, and I think there's an incompatibility between our faith in many cases in terms of what devout Muslims believe a society should be and what devout Christians believe a society should be. And I think we're inviting, and maybe we can't stop it because the peoples aren't replacing themselves.
Well, again, a demographic winner is not a way to continue a republic or a country, and so we certainly have learned some lessons there. Just about out of time, but I wanted to encourage people, if they wanted to know more about some of the things that you've been writing, they can go to Buchanan.org. We have a link to Pat Buchanan's website. We have an article that's sort of an excerpt out of the book, and we have that very important speech that you gave based on the book at the Nixon Library. So, Pat, we've always counted you as such a great friend, Marlon Maddox.
Well, you all have been such great friends over the years.
Yes.
And we're going back to the old days.
Well, it's just been great to have you there. It was great to see you, pictures of you when you were younger, pictures of Shelley when she was working with Pat Nixon. So I learned a lot more about you and Shelley. Was it Scarney? I did not know her maiden name.
Scarney, that's right.
Yeah, so again, it was
It's
a delightful
Italian
book.
name shortened.
Well, Pat, it's always been great to have you on the program. Thank you for doing it. I look forward to maybe the next book where we learn a little more about Watergate, but I've learned a great deal from your book today, The Greatest Comeback, and I appreciate you joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you, Kerby.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into some other issues. One of those is the issue of poverty. You know, we are on the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty. How's that working for you? And this new book out, fascinating book, For the Least of These, A Biblical Answer to Poverty. And it is written by a number of individuals that have been on this program with us before. We're going to talk with one of the editors who will kind of give us a brief overview of the book. And then we'll spend some time looking at her particular aspect there. Then in the last half hour today, we're going to be spending some time talking with Representative Frank Wolf, who's been perhaps one of the best advocates for Christians who are being persecuted in the Middle East. Very concerned, of course, right now about the purging of Christians. We've seen this in Syria. We've seen it in Egypt. Now we're seeing it in Mosul, Iraq, and so we'll be talking with him as well. So lots to cover on the program today still, and if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the buttons that we have on our website, in addition to buttons where you can order these two books that we're talking about today, is one called Blurred Lines, and it is one of the concerns that we addressed last week when we were talking about the influence of the gay agenda, and really one of the greatest threats we have found to religious freedom, because oftentimes when there is a debate between religious freedom and the gay agenda, religious freedom loses. And so we are convinced that one of the most important weapons in dealing with this is education, and we are really dedicated to educating you and the next generation about some of these important issues. And so we have an opportunity there for you to click on that button, find out a little bit more, and maybe even support this program, as you are now probably receiving either emails from me or even our Outlook magazine addressing this particular issue. And if you have not received those, you might want to click on the button there that says Get Involved, so that we can make sure we get that information to you. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk with Ann Bradley about poverty from a biblical perspective. Stay tuned. We'll have more right after this.
Across the nation, this is Point of View. For materials offered during the broadcast, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track, and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Over the last few months, we've looked back over the 50 years of the war on poverty, and we certainly have tried to give you sort of a biblical perspective. But this first half hour here, this hour, we're going to spend some time getting into it in more detail, because we have recognized some of the real problems of a welfare state and the need, if we really are serious about dealing with poverty, to do that in a way that is economically feasible and also biblically justifiable. And we're going to be quoting from quite a bit a book that we are making available today on our Point of View store called For the Least of These, A Biblical Answer to Poverty. It is edited by Anne Rathbone Bradley, and we're going to be talking with her in just a minute, and Art Lindsley. And when you look through the various contributors, it's kind of a who's who of people we've had on the program. We've had, of course, Glenn Sunshine and Walt Kaiser, and of course, Art Lindsley in the past, as well as, I guess Brian Griffiths has never been on here, but I quote from him oftentimes, and Robert Sirico and Marvin Olasky, Jay Richards, as well as is endorsed by other individuals like Wayne Grudem, who's been on the program quite often. And this is an important work, and we wanted you to be able to hear a little bit more about how to address this issue of poverty from a biblical point of view. Dr. Anne Rathbone Bradley is the Vice President of the Economic Initiatives at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, and she is very much involved in articulating some of these ideas. She's been a visiting professor at Georgetown University and previously taught at George Mason University. She's also worked, and we'll probably want to talk with her in the future about a book she's working on right now, which relates to another aspect of her involvement, looking at the political economy of terrorism and the issue of Al-Qaeda, as she actually worked for a period of time as an economic analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency's Office of Terrorism Analysis, received her PhD in economics from George Mason University. And Dr. Bradley, it is a delight to have you on the program with us today.
Hi, Kerby. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
I want to spend a little bit of time talking about your particular chapter, because that gets into the issue of income inequality, something we've talked about. But for just a minute, since you are the editor of the entire book, let's talk about the scope, because you have a whole section on a biblical perspective on the poor, then a section on markets, especially the idea of free markets in the poor, and then a section on poverty alleviation in practice. And this was presented at, I think it was the Heritage Foundation. We've posted that there, in which you and Art spoke, and then somebody who's joined us on the roundtable here at Point of View many times, Michael Craven. So people can watch the entire interview. We encourage people not only to watch the video, but then there's a share button there so that people can click on that. Maybe you could put it on their Facebook page or their blog, or send it to others, so that we can sort of maximize the exposure. But this was sort of a coming out party in which you spent some time talking about all the different aspects of what you addressed in the book.
That's right, and thank you for that. This is a very much an interdisciplinary approach, which is part of what our institute is about, in the sense that we believe as Christians, the Bible provides theology for all of life, and so we can go to it, and we are called to go to it for direction and guidance on everything. And so why wouldn't we do that when we're thinking about poverty alleviation, both domestically and globally? And that's what this book is about. It's really trying to bring together theologians and economists, and then practitioners, people who are working day in and day out in the field to help people. And, the whole goal of poverty alleviation is to not be poor anymore. So, trying to get people to transition out of poverty is the goal. And that's why we wrote the book.
Well, and I think you've done a very good job. In my latest book, I have a chapter on wealth and poverty. And, of course, Jay Richards, who has written there, talks about some of the myths that people have about wealth and poverty and free markets. And, of course, Wayne Grudem, we've talked even more broadly about the issue of global poverty. But when you talk about a biblical perspective on the poor, you have contributors both from the Old Testament perspective and the New Testament perspective. And it seems to me that most Americans probably are not aware of all the things the Bible has to say about the poor and how we can actually help the poor. That's right. And interestingly enough, there's debate among theologians over how many times you see the word the poor or poverty in Scripture. But most people believe that it's at least 300. And so we know for sure, with absolute certainty, that this is something Christians have to take seriously, that the Bible is very clear that we have responsibilities and accountabilities to people who cannot help themselves, who are unable to help themselves, and there's going to be a lot of different situations around that. And Glenn Sunshine, as you mentioned, he writes the first chapter, and he does a really good job biblically trying to help us understand that there's different types of poverty. So there's transitional poverty if you experience a hurricane or a tsunami or something like this. And we're going to help people in those circumstances very differently from perhaps somebody who is addicted to drugs and has lost their home and things like this. So it's all about getting in touch with the person. Well, that's the first lesson. And I think so, because, you know, people that are poor because of corruption, exploitation, misfortune, very different than those who are because of bad choices, maybe a decadent lifestyle. I mean, in one case, the scriptures say, go to the anthill sluggard and observe her ways and be wise, or those who will not work will not eat. Very different than helping the widows, the orphans, and the poor. And so I think in those first 5 chapters, you do a very good job of answering some of those questions. One of those Art addresses, which we've talked about before with others, but I think it's important to raise again, and that is some that will maybe take the book of Acts out of context and say, well, they had economic koinonia. That really gives us a justification for, first of all, maybe communism or socialism, or at the very least gives the state permission to redistribute the wealth. And I think Art did a very good job of answering that question. Absolutely. And here's where, a holistic, exegetical approach is really important. I think what we have to all do, first and foremost, is take off our, what ideology do I kind of normally cling to, and go to the Bible first. I mean, that's what we have to do, and that's what Art does a good job of in his chapter, is what does Acts really say? And the other thing is that the Scripture, we know, doesn't contradict itself. So if you see one Bible verse and it seems to say something that contradicts the meta-narrative of Scripture or other verses, then we're probably not understanding the whole context there. And so he does a good job of saying what was going on in Acts in the early church when people were voluntarily sharing with each other. And the word voluntary is key there. That's what he notes, is that people shared as they saw fit. They did not give up all of their property rights. There was no, kind of elimination of property rights or surrendering all of our assets to a government. And so those are really important things to pull out when we're looking to the Scripture for answers on these things. Talking with Dr. Ann Rathbone Bradley, who is Vice President of Economic Initiatives for the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics. We're going to take a break. When we come back, though, I want to spend some time on your chapter, Why Does Income Inequality Exist? An Economic and Biblical Explanation. And obviously, as people watch the video, they'll be able to see the graphs and charts. But I think we can do a pretty good job of talking about the diversity of gifts, the diversity of abilities, what happens in free markets, and the rest. And so we'll continue our conversation with her, and certainly commend to you this book, which is a very excellent collection of all sorts of different articles by individuals that have been on this program before. 400 pages, many of these individuals we have heard from individually, but to have this in one volume, very helpful. And we are making it available today on our website, pointofview.net. It's called For the Least of These, The Biblical Answer to Poverty. We'll continue our conversation with her right after these important messages.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the scandal at the Veterans Administration seems to grow larger each day. A recent audit of the VA showed that more than 57,000 patients are still waiting for initial appointments more than 90 days after requesting them. An additional $64,000 are enrolled but have never seen a doctor. This is a scandal that won't be solved by merely changing one or two bureaucrats at the VA. Former House Speaker Newt Gingrich explained why in a pointed open letter to Robert McDonald, the president's choice to head up the Veterans Department. He argues that what is needed is a transformation of the bureaucracy. Gingrich illustrates the problem by using the red bead experiment constructed by Edward Deming. He used a bin full of red beads and white beads mixed together. Deming would explain to an audience his intention to gather up just the white beads. He would plunge the scoop into the bin and bring out a mix of both kinds of beads. Feigning disbelief, he would then appoint other people to wield the scoop. They would also bring up a mix of red and white beads. His point is that you can change personnel in a broken system and you still get failure. People will fail one after the other until the system is changed. Gingrich says that the range and scale of the misconduct at the VA shows that the corruption there, like the doomed attempt to isolate white beads, is not just a problem of personalities, but more importantly of systems, and it goes to the very core of the bureaucracy. He concludes that the VA is a giant fossilized bureaucracy that must be replaced rather than repaired. But he also laments that entrenched bureaucrats, the unions, and the president, along with many members of Congress, will oppose the systemic changes that could actually work. We need a future president and Congress who are dedicated to making real changes in the VA. And frankly, until that happens, we'll be hearing more examples of problems in the Veterans Administration. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Ann Rathbone-Radley. She is the Vice President of Economic Initiatives for the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, talking about the book that she co-edited, For the Least of These, A Biblical Answer to Poverty. We're going to focus a little time and attention on her chapter, about 30 pages. We'll do our best to try to cover some of that. Why does income inequality exist? And Dr. Bradley, first of all, I guess we have to recognize that if you allow freedom at all in a free market, there are different gifts and different abilities, different ministries. It talks about that in 1 Corinthians 12. Some people are going to be maybe more likely to pursue risk than others. Some people might have more of an entrepreneurial spirit than others. Some people bring certain gifts that have a market value. So a level of income inequality is always going to exist if you have a free market. But help us understand this, since this has become kind of one of the drumbeats this year during this election.
Absolutely. I think this issue is not going to go away. So as Christians, we really need to understand it so we can focus on what's right and how do we get justice and, how do we help the poor around all of these issues. And, what you said is kind of the assertion that I'm making in my chapter, which is that in a flourishing society, in a society where people are able to wake up and decide what they want to be and use the gifts God has given them in a lot of different ways, you're going to have different levels of income. And I think just solely focusing on the differences in our income misses the bigger point of how are people really doing? Just, kind of saying, okay, Bill Gates has this much and somebody who's, doesn't have that much, what's the difference? That's not as relevant or important as how are the people at the bottom income quintiles doing and how do they get out of the bottom? And that's what we really want to focus on. And we talk about that as income mobility. So do you have an opportunity to start out at the bottom rung of that economic ladder and work your way up? That's really the sign of prosperity, the sign of an opportunity society.
You know, one of the things that you point out in your graphs, and again, people can watch your video so they'll see some of those graphs, but I've tried to explain it on air, and sometimes we've even posted those, is that income mobility is significant because, frankly, there are a lot of people that were in the top level that dropped down for all sorts of reasons. Maybe they won the lottery, they got a very significant payout, they were in the highest income, but then they retire. So just in addition to the individuals that can rise from the lowest to the top, there are those who rise from the top down as well. And so this idea that the 1% are always the 1%ers isn't necessarily the case, is it?
It's not the case at all. In fact, at the top 1% of the income distribution in the United States, which is what we tend to focus a lot of our attention on, is where there's a high level of mobility downwards.
Yes.
And actually we want to see this, it's healthy. In other words, when you make it big monetarily, there shouldn't be a guarantee per se that you stay there, that income is guaranteed forever, because in a market-based society, the only way you can earn high levels of profit, which turns itself into high levels of income, is for you to serve customers, to innovate, to give them what they need and want. And so we should never want a guarantee. There should be that pressure all the time that you have to serve people, give them what they need, make their lives better and easier. And if you don't, you get kicked out of the top income quintile. So that's a healthy thing as well.
Let's take some phone calls along the way. We have Dr. Ann Rathbone Bradley with us for just a few more minutes, and we'll go first to the state of California, listening on the Internet. David, thank you for calling today.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Kerby. And Ann, I had a question for her, but I also had a correction for you, Kerby, on your earlier editorial about the VA. I don't know if you know it, but, for 40 years, since the end of the Vietnam War, the VA did not recognize Agent Orange. And so for 40 years, people have been without care. But the Obama administration has finally recognized it, and it said that the workload being put on VA is 5 million people. It's not just the vets, but it's their wives and children who were also exposed to it. So nobody wanted to budget that, the Congress was not giving money to the VA to cover a new workload of 5 million people. And so obviously this time delay of getting people covered, they can walk in there, but they're going to have to wait months before they're going to get any Agent Orange coverage.
Yeah, another backlog. Good point.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's an ugly scene, and they're playing it as if, healthcare can never work, when in fact they're not budgeting it. But I wanted to ask, the overall principle that I look at with this issue of poverty is, if it's God's property, if this whole earth is God's property, then poverty is a mismanagement of God's property. So, if you could speak to that.
So,
David,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's a great point, and I think you're right that we are called, and we see this right in Genesis, that we are the stewards of what God has given us, and we are called to, from our gifts and our skills and our talents, cultivate what He created. That's why we're here. We're called to work. That this is a call that exists before the fall of man. And so we're supposed to, with our ingenuity and creativity, engage in kingdom-building work. And poverty, as Dr. Brian Griffiths calls it, is a scar on human dignity. It's a waste of human resources. It's something that God never wants for us. And so I agree that it is a stewardship issue.
Talk about for just a minute, because on the one hand, the scriptures talk about the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Okay, so we obviously have the fact that God owns it all. But on the other sense, and that gets back maybe to what your co-author talked about a little bit, the issue of private property, and even what Brian Griffiths talks about, fighting poverty through enterprise. It seems to me that you also have to hold those two ideas in tension. That is private property rights, but also, of course, ultimately we are stewards of God's creation. How do you put those together?
I think the way that we have to view this is that all things are from Christ. We're here because He created us. The earth is here because He created it, but He created it with a purpose, and we're building towards the future new heavens and new earth. And so when we think about it that way, we have a very important role here. We weren't just given these gifts willy-nilly. They are very intentional. And God has created us to do something uniquely that no other person can do exactly like us. And I think when you really embrace that way of thinking, it is so liberating and so exciting because, no one has ever existed on the planet just like we have. And so in this sense, we're given property rights to be good stewards. Property rights are how we steward the gifts that God has given us, both land, both the creation, and our talents.
And I'd add one more because Robert Sirico talks about that vocation and calling. I mean, everybody needs to understand what their gifts are and their calling. And that is, again, a revolutionary idea that really goes back to biblical concepts, which we, I think, need to recapture, don't we?
I absolutely agree. And I think that this is what we're seeing. I see it in the college classroom, which is that, the attitude we take is that we have to be the best in the world, that we have to make the most money possible, that we have to win all the awards, and certainly having integrity and perseverance and trying to do our best is very important, but God did not create all of us to be the best in the world at what we do. And when you take the pressure of that off, which is not biblical, but that God created you to do something, it's unique and special, and only you can do it in that way, then, we can really live into the delight and fulfillment of who He's created us to be. And kind of the worldly competition then that's false falls away.
Very good. Dr. Bradley, it's just been a delight to have you on the program, and I wanted to educate our people for just a few minutes about the fact that this book is out. Maybe we can come back and schedule interviews with some of the other contributors, but 400 pages for the least of these, A Biblical Answer to Poverty. We have a link to the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, but just before we let you go, talk about what will be found by our listeners as they go to that website.
On our website, you'll be able to download or order the book, www.tifley.org, and also, as you mentioned earlier, you can watch the heritage video, and you can see individual chapters of the book. So I highly recommend it if you're really interested in this kind of intersection between what does the Bible have to say about life and what is economics? How does it help us use scarce resources? There's a lot on our website that I think you'll find interesting.
So you can go there and get the book. And again, we have a link to it, but again, it's tifwe.org, just in case you want to find it individually, but we also have a link to it on the website. We have information about the book and an article about it on our website, and of course the video that you can watch. Let me encourage some of you to hit that share button and share it with others. And so thank you for joining us today on this program, and we look forward to the next opportunity.
Thanks, Kerby. Have a great day.
We will take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk for just a few minutes with Representative Frank Wolf as we talk about what is happening in the Middle East. And if you'd like to join our conversation on that point, we will give you that opportunity as well. This is an important time in which we're trying to cover lots of very important issues. I can remember a time when June and July and even August were really light months in terms of issues and news. That has not been the case this summer, and lots to talk about. We're going to talk about, though, the purge of Christians in the Middle East, and Representative Frank Wolf has been a champion to address these issues. We'll talk with him and love to get some of your comments, and so we'll talk with you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
In the last half hour, I want to spend some time talking about this Christian purge that is taking place in Iraq, but has been occurring all through the Middle East, especially as with an he is perhaps the most preeminent spokesperson to this issue, and that is Representative Frank Wolf, who again is one of the representatives from the state of Virginia, serving in his 17th term in Congress, represents the 10th district. understand that he is going to step down, but he's assured me that he will still continue to address these issues. And Representative Wolf, always a delight to have you on the program with us.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
And I'm glad that you aren't going to walk away from this. I knew you wouldn't because of your passion for this, and appreciate the fact that you have been one of those very few voices sometimes speaking to this very significant issue. And I think a good example comes from the Wall Street Journal the other day. They said, imagine if a fundamentalist Christian sect captured a French city, began a systematic purge of Muslims, their mosques destroyed, their crescents defaced, the Quran burned, and then all Muslims were forced to flee or face execution. First of all, they say such an event would be unthinkable today, but if it did occur, Pope Francis and all other Christian leaders would denounce it and support efforts by governments to stop it. There's a silence from Jews, Christians, moderate Muslims about what has been taking place in Iraq. Fill in the details, if you might.
Well, more biblical activity took place in Iraq than any other country of the world other than Israel. Abraham's from Iraq. It's the modern city. It was called Ur, but it's called Nasiriyah. Jonah, Nineveh. We all know that's Mosul, where you now see what all the Christians have been forced out of Mosul. Ezekiel is buried there. Daniel, one of the great men of the Bible, Daniel is buried in Iraq. Daniel lived there. As you know, they were taken to Babylon, and yet you're seeing the eradication, the end of Christianity in Iraq. 2002 and 3, there were 1.5 million, now down to probably 250,000 maybe. Canon Vicar White, who's the canon of the Anglican Church in Baghdad this weekend, said that the world has forgotten this, and we may very well see the end. And I think we are going to see, if something dramatic is not done, we will literally see the end of Christianity in Iraq and soon to be in Syria. Paul couldn't go on the road from Jerusalem to Damascus, and where that road is so dangerous and what's taking place to Christians. And the problem is, one, this administration isn't doing anything. They're not saying anything. They're not speaking out. They're not articulating. They're not doing anything. Secondly, there's great silence in the West.
Yes.
Pope Francis has been very good. He has spoken out for this. But the leaders of every denomination should speak out. They should advocate for it. They should speak out for it. And there's almost it's like we're almost paralyzed. And frankly, the Congress hasn't been much better. But we are literally going to see the end of Christianity. And the Coptic Christian community, I was in Egypt last year, they're having a very difficult time. Many are now looking to leave to go to Australia, going to Canada, going to America. And so we are going to see the emptying out of Christians in the land of where Christianity began. And if you know, in Iraq, many of them there speak Aramaic, the very same language as Jesus, and yet there's a sound of silence, and nobody seems to really care. There's a lot that could be done. The president could, one, thank the Kurds, because now they've left Mosul, they've gone into the Kurdish area, and to the Kurds' credit, they are protecting the Christians. We don't know for how long, but they are currently protecting many. The elderly who are left behind have all had to convert. Imagine if you were forced to convert. Can you imagine? But so the Kurds are protecting them. We should thank the Kurds. Secondly, they're in many of the areas, they're without water, they're without supplies, they're without anything. And so I think to take some existing foreign aid, reprogram it, and give it to groups like Catholic Relief or World Vision to meet the needs of the Christian community that are kind of languishing there in the area now called Kurdistan. Thirdly, Maliki flew Shia out of Mosul and left the Christians to fend for themselves. And of course, as you know, the Christians do not have any militia, and so we have to put pressure on the Maliki government. So there's a lot that can be done to sort of alleviate, and yet there's great silence. There's silence by the administration, silence by the president, silence by the Secretary of State, and I think, to be fair, silence by the Congress.
Yeah, and I think you've done a very good job of articulating all of that, and we do have activists that maybe we've given them some action items. But again, when you think about the fact that Christians have lived in Mosul for nearly 2,000 years, and its history is just amazing, and you alluded to what it is like for Christians who, when ISIS comes in, the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, that basically says leave or die. And so they leave really with just the clothes on their back because of those militants have actually robbed them of all of their possessions, haven't they?
They have. They're taking the crosses down from the church. They're spraying with spray paint the N, Nazarene. The N means Nazarene, Christian. They're spraying that on the homes. The elderly who can't move, if you're elderly, and they are staying behind and they are converting. And the young are leaving, the middle-aged, those who can move, are just going. But they leave with literally not packing, saying, "Okay, we're leaving tomorrow. What do we take?" They're literally fleeing with their just the clothing on their backs. And I think one of the comments, we met with the patriarch on Thursday of last week. I think their greatest frustration is they're not hearing the United States government, nor are they hearing the church in the West to speak out and advocate. And if we do not speak out and advocate for, we are going to see the end of Christianity.
Wow. We've quoted before on this program Dennis Prager, who said, when he used to travel around from a Jewish perspective and talking about the Soviet Jews and everything, he always, even as a young man, wondered, where are the Christians speaking out about the Christians in the Soviet Union? And today you have that same kind of thing, because we can imagine that if indeed there were Jews that were being persecuted, there are all sorts of Jewish groups that would address this issue. The hypothetical that the Wall Street Journal pointed out, that if a fundamentalist Christian sect was attacking Muslims, we know we'd hear the world outcry. But it almost seems like, once again, that not only are we not hearing from the church, but we're not even seemingly concerned about what has unfolded. And this is not the first time, because as you alluded to just a minute ago, look at what has happened in Egypt to those in the Coptic church who have been scattered, and even other Christians that left Iraq into Syria, now leaving there. There's an attempt, I think, to really purge Christian involvement completely out of the Middle East, don't you think?
There is, and in other parts of the world too. But even in, we put together a resolution 3 or 4 weeks ago with Anna Eshoo, who's a Democrat. We had 200 groups come in and sign a petition here to advocate for a group of things. One, to have a special envoy to advocate for Christians and other religious minorities in the Middle East. We just passed, it was Roy Blunt's bill in the Senate, and Eshoo and my bill in the House. We just passed that Friday. Well, one of the churches that we asked to sign the resolution wouldn't sign it, the Presbyterian Church. And it pained me because, one, I am Presbyterian. I mean, the history of the Presbyterians, Witherspoon, the only signer of the Declaration of Independence, Dr. Elston, the history, Louis Evans from National Press, they would not sign it because they told us they were fearful of offending the Muslims in the Middle East.
That's amazing.
So if your own people will not come and defend you, it's just so. We're going to see the end of Christianity, and we're running out of time. Went from 1.5 million down to 250,000, and if you were a young person, would you stay?
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to, I already see some calls coming in, so 1-800-351-1212. We have Representative Frank Wolf with us for just a few more minutes. Let me just mention that we've done a few things. First of all, we have a link to his website. The first article there, Christians in Iraq, it's one of the very important pieces that comes from the speaking that he did. If you click on the extra button there, it will show actually his presentation last Friday on this, and then there's a where which you can click and find some of the earlier statements, all related to this Christian purge that has been taking place right now in Iraq. But certainly the purge by ISIS right now is the most visible and most brutal, but there have been many other similar examples, as we've alluded to. Radical Muslims in Egypt have driven the Coptic Christians from their homes. You have radical Muslims in all parts of Africa that have killed and persecuted Christians. We need to lend our voice to this issue. We encourage you to do so, to express your opinion to your elected representatives, to the president, and we will come back and talk about some other action items. But if you'd like to to join the conversation today, we certainly will take your phone calls as well. 1-800-351-1212. We'll come back and continue our conversation with Representative Frank Wolf and also hear from you right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Representative Frank Wolf, if you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Let's go first to the state of Maine and talk to Susan. Thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. I am in Maine, Westbrook, Maine, and it's nice to talk to you, Kerby. I have a question in reference to what Pat Buchanan was bringing up on the first hour. About the unity we don't have, and I do agree. We did have that. And my question is, I think the Lord's Prayer being taken out of school by Supreme Court under the request or for the request of Madeline Murray O'Hare, an atheist. And what I was so young then, I was in my 20s, I'll be 75 in a few days. Why did that not go to a vote? I think that has had so much disrupting and causing so many problems in our country with the unity that we used to have.
Good point. You know, we were talking with Pat Buchanan about the lack of unity in the first hour, but Representative Frank Wolf, that sort of relates to this as well. I mean, why is it we're not hearing from the united voice of America saying, wait a minute, this is not right, that we have Christians being driven out of their homes? How many times have we even on this program said, where are the voices for Abraham, for example, and for some of the others that are being persecuted. Of course, now we're glad that Miriam Abraham has left Sudan, but it does seem to me that a united America speaking to the rights of the disadvantaged, whether they're American citizens or whether they're Christians overseas, is one of the problems that we've been talking about today.
Well, I don't know that I have the answer. I'll just read you a quote by Charles Finney. Here's what Charles Finney said. He said, if there's a decay of conscience, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the public press lacks moral discernment, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the church is degenerate and worldly, the pulpit is responsible for it. If the world loses interest, the pulpit is responsible. And then he goes on to say if there's a problem in Congress. So I really think the churches are going to have to provide the leadership. Now, Pope Francis has spoken out. The head of the Coptic Christian Church in England has spoken out. I think all the pastors and priests and rabbis should speak out. You know, there is a saying in the Middle East, first the Sephardi people and then the Sunni people. The Sephardi people, the Jewish population. Let me give you some facts. In 1950, the Jewish population of Iraq was roughly 150,000, maybe more, but roughly 150,000. Now there's 4 individuals left. Now maybe 1.
Wow.
So they are forced out, and now they're doing the same thing to the Christian community. And in Egypt, in 1950, the Jewish population of Egypt was roughly 80,000. I was in Egypt last year. We met with the Jewish leadership. There's 20 or more people, all women, all over 60, and synagogues are being closed and cemeteries are being overrun. And so what has happened to the Jewish community in Iraq and in Egypt is now happening precisely to the Christian community. And so unless the church speaks out, I mean, and every candidate running for president, every candidate running for Congress ought to have a position. What are you going to do? And, of course, you know, the words in the Declaration of Independence are a covenant not only with the people of Philadelphia in 1776, but with the entire world. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator, God, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And so the silence is deafening. It's sort of like the parallel is like during the days of William Wilberforce in England. Wilberforce spoke out against slavery, and people just kind of... So I don't know, but I think the answer may very well be the pulpit needs to speak out.
In the pulpits.
Now that they know, I mean, if you don't know, you can't speak out. But now that mainline stories are being carried, you're doing stories. So now everyone in the church ought to know, and therefore the leadership has to speak out the same way that Pope Francis spoke out.
One of our listeners wanted to know what was the Coptic Church all about, and that is actually Coptic Church is more in the Orthodox Christian tradition, and obviously we might have a theological disagreement here or there, although I was invited to speak to the Coptic Church this coming weekend, so obviously that if you're not familiar with that, you can look up online and find out a little bit more, but let's keep
in mind, they were evangelized by one of the disciples, and Jesus and Mary Joseph left Israel want to get away from her, went to Egypt. So Christianity has been in Egypt since the very, very beginning.
Very much so. And so that's kind of the background briefly. We can go into that in the future, but I just want to, before we run out of time, get one more phone call. We'll go to Missouri this time, listening on KNEO. Eric, you're on with Representative Frank Wolf.
Thank you very much, Kerby. I appreciate you and your guest. Congressman, you know, it seems to me there's an elephant in the room that's not being talked about, and that is United States of America culpability. Norm Nelson with Compassion Radio, who ministers to persecuted Christians all over the world, but right now a lot in Muslim lands, says that Christians were that you ask the Christians who lived in Iraq, were you better off with Saddam Hussein or now? They'll tell you hands down when Saddam Hussein was there. We are culpable. We are the ones who have put our Christian brothers and sisters.
I agree with you. I agree, but you're only looking at part of the picture. That may have taken place, but why are we not speaking out now? So let's say you're right, and I think you have a very good point. Why are we not speaking out now? Can that be an excuse for not speaking out? But also, where is the church not speaking out on China? Today in China, there are 24 Catholic bishops under house arrest, thousands of Protestant pastors under arrest. You have the Tibetans are being persecuted. The church is not speaking out. In Vietnam, the Buddhists are being persecuted. The Montagnards are being forced, they've all become evangelicals, they're being forced to renounce their faith. What about it? So, yes, that is the case, but that was not the case in Egypt, and nobody's saying anything about Egypt. That was not the case in Syria, and nobody's saying anything about Syria. But you got a good point. But because that took place in 2003 doesn't mean that we should do nothing. It doesn't mean, it means we should speak out. We should precisely advocate, speak out. Any group that's persecuted. If the Buddhists are being persecuted in Tibet, we as believers ought to be advocating for them. But the church has been silent. It's been silent under the current conditions. So we can't say, well, America shouldn't have gone into Iraq in 2003, so it's our fault, so therefore we should do nothing. We cannot do a Pontius Pilate on this. We have to deal with where we are at this time.
Just before we run out of time, you've given us a couple of action items. We have lots of activists listening to this program. What would you suggest?
One, call their congressmen and senators, urge them to have the president speak out. Secondly, have the president thank the Kurds for protecting the Christians. Fourthly, have the president tell Maliki to protect the Christians. And lastly, take some of the foreign aid that's being spent somewhere, give it to a group like World Vision, Catholic Relief, and let them give some water, food, clothing, some basic needs to the people who have left Mosul, who were gone north in Kurdistan, who are, frankly, have nothing more than the clothes on their back. Some things like that can be done.
Representative Wolf, we appreciate the fact that you are always standing for those persecuted individuals, and we appreciate the fact that you have served so well in Congress. We know that eventually you're going to step down, but I know we'll still hear your voice, and we hope we can call on you on a regular basis.
Thanks so much, and thank you, listeners, too.
We're going to take a break, and then tomorrow we're going to get back into some more very important issues. So I hope that you'll take the time to join us every single day here on Point of View, because we are certainly going to try to address very controversial issues and also try to give you some action items so that you can take some of those issues and really address those from a biblical perspective. And today we've spent some time in the first hour hearing from Pat Buchanan about his book, The Greatest Comeback. We've talked with Ann Bradley about her book that she helped edit, For the Least of These. And then finally, of course, we've talked with Representative Frank Wolf and encourage you to take some action. Tomorrow we're going to spend just a little bit of time initially talking about this issue of sexual abuse. Perhaps some of you that actually go out on the internet have seen some of these things which have asked, when were you abused? And we're going to talk about that and spend some time addressing that very important issue. And then we're going to move into some other topics that we are going to be addressing here as well, giving you a chance to join our conversation. Matter of fact, we'll spend a little bit of time talking with Edward Klein's latest book, Blood Feud, and that is the feud between the Clintons and the Obamas. We'll get into that and, of course, give you a chance to join our conversation. Later in the week, we'll be talking with Ray Comfort and Wayne Allen Root and so many other guests, so I hope that each day you will tune into Point of View. I would encourage you to visit our website, pointofview.net. That's where you will find lots of information on the various books that we've discussed and the videos that you might want to post on your web page or on your Facebook page or in a blog. I want to thank those who have been part of this broadcast today behind the scenes. That's Andrew, Catherine, and Chris. Have a great day. We will see you back here tomorrow.
You have been listening to Point of View. For materials offered on the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.